Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation on community safety, driver's license suspensions, and fairness. I'm Minda Brooks, Program Director for the North Carolina Leadership Forum. I'm excited to be your moderator for the first part of our conversation. First, let me start with a little context. Last spring, the North Carolina Leadership Forum partnered with the Wilson Center for Justice and Science at Duke Law to convene a forum on community safety. We recently published a report of the findings from that forum, and this conversation builds on that work. If you haven't seen the report yet, check it out on our website. We'll drop the link in the chat for you. The forum brought together leaders from across North Carolina representing government, business, advocacy, and impacted communities to discuss a very big question. What should we do to keep North Carolina communities safe? Participants were intentionally selected to represent a range of political perspectives and different life experiences. The goal was not a 5-point action plan or a list of recommended solutions. Instead, participants focused on building authentic relationships and increasing understanding across divides. In over 4 meetings, participants engaged in deep conversations. They considered difficult trade-offs, and they leaned into areas where they were far apart to better understand each other. The group identified a broad set of concerns about community safety, ultimately narrowing to 4, where they perceived both a need for and interest in action, but also strong disagreement. The 4 concerns were: there is a lack of adequate and appropriate treatment for behavioral health needs. Number 2, guns make communities less safe. Number 3, the collateral consequences of justice system involvement are harmful to individuals, families, and communities. And the 4th was there is a failure to address the root causes of crime. So for each of those concerns, participants brainstormed possible solutions and deliberated their benefits and their downsides. And they also talked about one important area of agreement, the need for increased focus on rehabilitation and reentry services. So today, we're going to hear from 3 participants in that process. First, I'm going to start with a few questions about their experience in the forum, and then my colleague from the Wilson Center, Lindsay Bass-Patel, will step in and moderate a conversation that takes a closer look at the trade-off between accountability and fairness when it comes to addressing the harm of collateral consequences of justice system. More specifically, they're going to talk about what is and isn't working with the current policy of fines, fees, and driver's license suspensions, and what changes or improvements could be taken to make it work better for more people. So now let me introduce our panelists. Senator Warren Daniel has represented District 46 for 8 terms, which currently includes Buncombe, Burke, and McDowell counties. Welcome, Senator. Frankie Roberts is the co-founder and executive director of Leading Into New Communities, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing shelter and services to individuals returning from prison. Frankie, it's nice to see you.
Thank you.
And Matthew Scott has been the district attorney for Robeson County since 2019 and has served as an assistant DA there since 2010. Thank you, Matt, for being here. All right, it's great to see you. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I'm going to start us out asking you a 2-part question. The first one is, what initially drew you to participate in the Community Safety Forum? You've got a lot going on. Why did you say yes? And then the second part of that is, what surprised you most about those conversations that we had? And Senator Daniel, I can start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Roberts and then DA Scott.
Thanks, Minda. So I think as far as how was I recruited into the seminar is that Justice Tamara Berenger kind of kept on me to participate, and so I really have a high regard for her and her opinion of this organization. So I agreed to do that, and I really like the topic because I've been a judiciary chairman in the Senate for most of the last 14 years, and also put together the Justice and Public Safety budget for the state of North Carolina, which we're doing as we speak. So it was just it was a topic that was sort of right down the silo that I've been in the Senate for the last decade.
And what surprised you about our conversations?
Obviously, there were some tough conversations, tough issues. It's good to see. It was a chance to meet people who you wouldn't meet, like Frankie, and to hear their perspectives, to become friends with them, and to kind of like look at things from a different angle, maybe, which you wouldn't necessarily be exposed to just if, you're always talking to the same people. So, just met some friends who maybe other side of the aisle type friends. Now, I've always been somebody that believed in a justice system that works. And so one of the issues that I've always worked on here for more than a decade has been expunctions and when should an expunction be allowed, and under what circumstances, how should it be expedited to try to help people. There are people who are justice involved that want to do the right thing and to get their lives back in order. And so I think that's what our justice system should do.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. And Frankie, what drew you to participate? And then maybe what surprised you about the discussions?
Well, I suppose the biggest thing is I was surprised I got invited. I don't know who invited me. I made a story up in my head that it was probably Jonathan Barfield, who was one of our commissioners who I know had participated. But yeah, I have to say yeah to those type conversations because I'm always looking to learn, but also looking to participate and be able to talk about the people that we provide support for. And I always believe that iron sharpens iron. So if I'm in the room with people who has some commonality with the issue, hopefully I know I was going to learn something, but hopefully I could also share information in the group that other people might say, I never thought about that perspective. And so, yeah, I was charged, in fact, pretty excited to be a part of the North Carolina Leadership Forum about this issue.
And was there any surprises for you?
I guess I have to echo what Senator Daniels just said. And that is, yeah, surprising to be in a room with people, some that I anticipate, and you know what they say about assumptions, was going to have a perspective totally different from mine. But being in that situation, sometime I had to look at the other person's perspective and made me take a different look at my own perspective. And in some instances have to move the other direction. And so I think for me, that was the biggest thing. In fact, one of the greatest things about being in a room with people that you wouldn't typically be in a room with that might not think like you think. And I think we probably should practice that more now than ever. Because at the end of the day, we all family.
Thank you. Thanks. I think we're going to return to some of those themes you just raised in a few more questions. And so, Matt, could you share what drew you? I know how you got. I know who nominated you,
Yeah.
and I know I had to hunt you down a little bit, but
Yeah.
but I finally got a hold of you.
Yeah. I first heard about it from my chair of the county commissioners in Robeson County, who had just finished up the previous forum, and he tracked me down and told me about it, and then I got the call about the invitation. I too was surprised about it, but also excited to participate, especially on this topic. And I got even more excited when I saw the vast backgrounds and experiences of the fellow participants, because I do feel like when people typically talk about public safety, they focus on, individuals wearing uniforms, DAs, judges, which is right. But if you just look at it from that perspective, you're really missing a lot of players who impact public safety. I am one who strongly believes that education I think has the greatest impact on public safety, either in the positive or negative when it comes to your community. So seeing individuals from the health field and nonprofits and the like at the tables that we were at discussing these topics was exciting. What surprised me the most was that even though we did come from such vastly different backgrounds and what you might on the face of it perceive as different opinions, I think we came to some commonality on a lot of issues. And so the fact that we could agree on a lot of that, I thought was surprising. But I think it was attributed to the fact that we were in a position to have open and frank discussions, and express our opinions, and really dig into these topics. Now, I do believe we could have spent another 6-7 months digging even deeper, but I think the forum itself opened it up to us being able to freely speak our minds on the issue, and also listen to people's perspectives.
Thank you. And I want to follow up on something that each of you touched on in one way or another. But at some point, you thought of something in a new way. A challenge, you had an assumption challenged, or your perspective kind of shifted a little bit. I'd love for you to tell us more about that, and just share, if you can, an example or a moment when that happened, and we can start, with Matt, if you want to start, and then we'll go in the reverse order.
I'll go with Frankie because I want to hear what he had to say.
Frankie, on to you.
Okay, there's a young man on our team that has a concept that's called L769. And that if you sit on one side of the table, a L is a 7, and on the other side of the table it's a L. Same with the 6 and the 9. So one of the things that this conversation did in that regard, what you see is based on where you sit. And so there were perspectives that I had simply because of how I was raised, the work I do every day. And sometimes I might not have given room of what it looks like on the other side of the table. And so getting in this room and having open dialogue where people was kind of prepped not to take things personally, it gave you a way to look at things more objectively, and to really listen to another perspective. And at times those perspectives, you scratch your head and say, dang, I never thought of it that way. And so then you were able to put your perspective together with another person's perspective. And sometimes you had to shift because that other person's seat maybe had a more linear view of that issue. And so, yeah, it kept me back and forth. And my wife probably appreciated that more because I probably became a little bit more balanced.
I think I've heard that before you're not the first person who's mentioned that. Senator Daniel, you want to add to that?
Sure, I'll just say, so in terms of the specific presentation that was my favorite was the Durham, I think it was the Durham Sheriff's Department or either Durham City Police that had the program where I think they called it the HEART program.
HEART program, yes, yeah.
And they approached law enforcement with a multidisciplinary approach where they'd go on a call and they would have EMTs and maybe a social worker or a mental health professional. And that they were just finding that, I just had preconceived notions about that going in, that this is not a concept that can work. It's too expensive. It's sort of maybe coddling bad people. But it seemed like from their presentation that it had some of the opposite effects, that it It saved some of the mental issues that it helped police to deal with what they should deal with, and let the other services deal with calls that a police officer might not need to go on. So it just seemed like something that could be a model for other areas of the state to adopt. And so that was probably my favorite thing from the presentations. I guess if there was something that I think was the hardest issue for people to agree on, it would be the issue of guns in the community, because it revolves around, the Second Amendment and people's views of that. So I think that maybe was the issue that had the least resolution among our group. But it was still a very valuable conversation.
Yep. Matt, I'm going to give you a shot at this. Do you
Yeah.
have any?
No, just to piggyback on it, I think, I don't know about changing my perspective, but these conversations definitely greatly informed my beliefs in some things, and challenged some thoughts on some things. Because I think, like Frankie said, I mean, you make the best decision you can with the information that you have. And you can make better decisions with obviously more relevant information. And sometimes we just don't have the information, either through us not seeking it or through just it's not available. I'm gonna tell you, in those rooms, I would say across all the discussions we had on the issues we had, I think I was better informed from other people's life experiences, work experiences, things that I don't think I would have necessarily been able to get that perspective if I hadn't been a part of the forum, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because as a DA, this example we're talking about right now, I mean, this discussion we're talking about now about FTAs, FTCs, driver's license restoration, it would have never got my radar, but for somebody coming into my office and saying, "Hey, this is an issue. Here's how big the issue is," and then you digging into it. It wasn't that I sought it out. It was that it came to my desk, and now you're having to get information. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what I think I got from the forum.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know that each of you in your sphere of influence are working on community safety issues. And so just to expand a little bit, how has your experience in the forum shown up in your role in the work that you do professionally for your community? Would you like to talk a little bit in more detail about that?
Yeah, I can go. I think the HEART program that Senator Daniel talked about, obviously in Robeson County, since I've been elected, we've started a drug treatment program, a sobriety program, a law enforcement assisted diversion program, but all of those has highlighted the fact that a lot of the issues individuals we see in those programs are suffering from an underlying mental health issue that's driving the substance use issue. And so if you look at that HEART program, how they tackle that in Durham, has gotten me to figure out how we can somewhat incorporate that in say Robeson County. Obviously the clear thing is cost. So a huge cost actually. So we're working with some nonprofits and for-profits to get those discussions started to see if we can offset those costs by other things to try and incorporate some mental health and additional substance use treatment to our participants. So it's utilizing other people with other perspectives and other resources to try and tackle this public safety problem.
Great. Frankie, would you like to talk a little bit about how the experience is showing up, in your work?
Well, I would say, based on great timing, we recently, I was recently engaged in a community safety conversation with a local endowment. We have a New Hanover County endowment that is probably about 2 or 3 years old. And I happen to be on the advisory committee, and one of the pillars is community safety that the foundation is now researching. And so the good timing is the report that that you just put out on the website. I was able to share that with the group. We had a focus group 2 weeks ago, and so afterwards the report came out, and I was able to pretend like I was one of the experts since I was a part of this panel. And so that's the way it showed up. And they actually, meaning the endowment, included that report in their newsletter. And so I think safety has become one of the most relevant conversations across the country. And so being in that room has prepared me and can make recommendations on how locally we might be able to get at some solutions. And that is by putting different people in the room, especially people that's impacted by the issue that we are studying. You got, if the people that are impacted is not at the table, then you almost will never come up with a pliable solution.
Thanks for that. Thanks. And Senator Daniel, I know you said the HEART program really, you had to check some assumptions after you learned about that. Is there anything else from the forum that you're taking into your work right now?
I think it just, well, it's interesting that you say that. So we have at the legislature, you have days for every group. So this week it's the district attorneys. Matt's probably in the same building as I am right now. So, yesterday the DAs that came to talk to me are talking about, well, we need to increase punishments for this, this, and this. And so I've always, maybe it gives me, like now when people, and legislators are bad about this, like wanting to ratchet up criminal offenses from this level to that level. So it probably just makes me look at that a little bit with more of a critical eye, and that I don't think the answer to every problem in the criminal justice system is, well, we just need to put that type of a person in prison for longer. So I look at those with more skepticism now and say, is it really going to solve the problem? Because if somebody's committing a crime that's a Class E, are they just now not going to commit it because you move it to a Class D felony? Now, one of the things that seemed to be a recurring theme in the forum, which as a budget appropriator is not fun to hear, is that I think a lot of the members of the panel or the forum, the answer always seemed to be, well, if we could spend more money, if we just could spend another $1 million on this, then things would get better. And, as the frustrations of being a legislator for a decade is that there's never enough money for all of the good things that we would like to do, because there's so many areas of government. And so sometimes we are squeezing pennies and not always able to provide the funding that we wish we could.
Right. There's always that trade-off. And I think this is actually a great time to kind of segue into the next part of the conversation, and basically, I just wanted to name the fact that from the very first meeting, this group in particular was really expressed a very strong desire for these conversations to result in measurable change. They really wanted to do something. And so we are at that stage now where it's kind of the now what? Now what do we do? And so I'm really happy to bring in my colleague, Lindsay Bass-Patel, for this next part on what we do next. And let me just introduce Lindsay a little bit. She's a policy analyst with the Wilson Center. She works on addressing racial and socioeconomic inequities in the criminal legal system that are data informed. And she's currently really focusing on fines and fees reduction, low-level policing reform, and second chances for people sentenced to life and long sentences. So we're gonna, for the rest of the conversation, they're gonna dig into the issue of fines and fees and their connections to driver's license suspensions. And I also want to put out there, I saw on the list of registrants that we have a lot of people from the forum listening in, and we have a lot of other very smart, experienced, creative problem solvers. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas on how to improve this current system. So please share them in the chat, and as well as any questions that you may have for our panelists. And our colleague Jennifer Melton is managing all of that, and she'll bring up those questions in a little while. But Lindsay, I'm happy to hand the remainder of the conversation off to you to moderate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. What a pleasure to join this group. It is just fascinating to hear about this program and how you learned about your shared values, and now how you can think outside the box about these creative solutions for community safety. I do see this as kind of a brain trust that we have together today. You know, we have the NCLF cohort, and welcome to the folks who are outside of that cohort. I think that we can all be a part of this conversation. And like Minda said, you know, if you have suggestions, ideas, questions, put that in the chat. Let's have this as a conversation for the whole group. I'll talk a few minutes about background information about fines and fees and driver's license suspensions in North Carolina. Then we'll talk to our experts and then check in on those audience questions. Debt-based driver's license suspensions may not be on the radar of most people. I knew very, very little about fines, fees, and driver's license suspensions when I started researching this a couple years ago. But I've been working with a data scientist closely to understand the issue on a county by county basis. It's a little different everywhere across the state. If a person receives a traffic infraction for something like not wearing a seatbelt, not having an updated inspection, an outdated registration, or speeding, they're required to resolve that by paying online or going to court. If a person doesn't go to court to resolve that ticket, the judge marks it down as an FTA, failure to appear. And that FTA has a $200 fee. So in order to motivate the person to resolve their case, they're told they have a couple months before the DMV is going to suspend their license. Similarly, if a person handles their case in court or online, but they cannot pay the fine or fee, which is usually about $200 for a low-level traffic offense, it's called an FTC, a failure to comply. And they're told they have a couple months before the DMV suspends their license. So I'll be using those acronyms a lot, FTA, FTC. If they drive after their license is suspended, they can get another charge, and the cycle kind of continues, and it's hard to get out of it. In order to get their license back, the person's going to have to go to court or hire an attorney to represent them. Usually that's about $1,000 to hire an attorney. And there are limited times when a judge hears this type of case. Usually you can't walk in whenever you want to and just resolve it. Step 2, after you get the case resolved in court, is that the person also has to get an appointment with a DMV, have a restoration hearing, sometimes with character witnesses, and pay more money, about $83, plus a $50 service fee may apply. And then the DMV decides whether or not they get their license back. So according to our most recent data, almost 1 million people in North Carolina have an FTA or an FTC, and so they have a suspended license. That's about 10% of our entire population for the state. The process to resolve an FTA or an FTC takes about a year for most people who can actually resolve it. And after that, these cases are resolved less and less as time goes on, such that about half of this 1 million people hasn't had a license for like up to 10 years. They really are isolated out of the community. Losing your driver's license, and especially in a state that has little public transportation, makes life very chaotic. You can't drive to your job, of course. You can't take your kids to the pediatrician appointments, buy groceries, get your prescriptions filled, and so on. And so I'd really like to start with Mr. Roberts and ask his perspective on what is going on in the real world. I've heard you say recently that the solutions are close to the problem, and I'd love to dig into that reality. from your experience, what are the most common real world consequences of driver's license suspensions?
Well, to continue the revolving door of incarceration. I mean, I guess that's the most practical one. So we work with people. My job is reentry. We provide support for people coming out of prison. Today, we serve a little over 800 people a year. And certainly when a person is coming out of prison, most of our population does not have a driver's license. And so what that means for us is without a driver's license, you are not as employable as you could be if you had a driver's license, especially since a lot of the jobs, a person will always say, I need a person with a driver's license, especially related to construction or jobs that will constitute driving in that job description. And so what we find is we spend a lot of time helping a person get their license back, and typically it's related to fees and fines that they had prior to incarceration. And it just kind of augmented itself. And some of those folks were in prison because they didn't pay the fees and fines. And so in the real world, yeah, I almost feel like we ought to get rid of fees and fines, or have a way that we can do an assessment on the front end so that a person is not taxed when they can't afford to pay. So they're not penalized for being poor. And so that's how it looked like in the real world. And because most people are throwing the dice every day and driving anyway. And then they probably don't have insurance, or if they get in an accident, yeah, it spins out of control. And if we look at the North Carolina numbers, they are out of control. The millions of dollars that is owed and probably hadn't been paid and probably won't get paid. And lastly, I'll say, I know in our county back in 2021, fortunately, we was able to work with our chief district court judge and our DA at the time to forgive and remit a lot of the fees and fines. And it was extremely successful. And we saw the benefit because some of the individuals we were working with at the time was able to get their driver's license back and get back on track. So I'll stop there.
That's really helpful to understand, the context. This is a big part of somebody's life. And it is hard to get back on track when you can't drive. DA Scott, I'd love to hear how you became interested in this topic. Robeson County has one of the highest rates of FTAs and FTCs, and thus driver's license suspensions in the state. Tell us more about why you care about this issue and about your first steps to address it.
Yeah, sorry, my laptop just shut down, so I had to shift to my phone, so I apologize. But I first came aware of this when I first got elected in 2019, or got in office in 2019. At the time, a state legislator, local legislator, came to me to highlight this issue. Like I said, I had no clue about it. But in looking at the data, it appeared that some of the data indicated that at least 2/3 of the people driving the roads of Robeson County were driving on a revoked license, revoked or suspended license. And so when I started looking at that, I'm like, well, if they're on a revoked license and it's that many, then 2/3 of the time, if there's a fender bender accident and the person that has a license and insurance and it ain't their fault, the person that's at fault, there's a 2/3 likelihood that they don't have any insurance. And so then you start looking at the ripple effects from that. Okay, so now I'm having to pay, my insurance is covering to fix my own car. Okay, then where's insurance rates going? If you keep just going down this path, where's insurance rates going? They're gonna eventually increase, and the person with the license and insurance is going to be paying a lot more than they should be. So we had to look into why, and there is a difference between. Let me make sure we're clear. There's a difference in an FTA and an FTC. There's a difference in failure to appear and failure to comply. And so we were looking at, okay, failure to appear just means the individual just didn't show up for court. The charge is still out there. A lot of times, charge is still out there. They didn't show up for court. Failure to comply is okay. These individuals handled the underlying matter, whether it be a speeding ticket, improper equipment, whatever. These individuals came to court or was represented in court, handled the underlying charge. So you could argue, I think pretty conventionally, that they took responsibility for, right, the underlying issue. They just have not paid the fines and fees associated with it. Okay, so if we look at that, how many is that? In Robeson County is thousands. Just on failure to comply, not dealing anything with failure to appear, just with failure to comply. We're talking thousands. So then you go and talk to our local business owners, small business owners. Well, what's the problem? Well, we got a lot of jobs. Okay, well, we got a lot of people that can conceivably fill those jobs. Well, what's the issue? Well, in order for you to be employed by these a lot of them companies or businesses, you have to have a driver's license. If they don't have a driver's license, they can't employ them. So we're cutting off individuals that took responsibility for the underlying charge, but had not paid the fines and fees, cannot get the job that's there to be taken. Employers wanting to hire them, but can't because they don't have a license, right? So now it's an economic issue. And I took it as I would rather have, if you've got individuals who have FTCs, right, who want to be employed. I got employers who want to employ them. I would rather have them being employed, paying the taxes associated with getting a paycheck. That Senator Daniel now has more money in the coffers to hopefully fund some of these other programs, right? I'd rather have them doing that than not being able to work at all, because if they're not able to work at all, people will find a way to pay for groceries. People will find a way to pay for, right, needs, the hierarchy of needs. And I'd rather find them, have them paying for it legitimately than not. So if I'd rather have them working than not. And so what we've tried to do is go back and look at who all has been licensed, been suspended because of FTCs. Our judges are then waiving fines and fees so that these individuals can now go back and hopefully obtain licenses. But what we're also doing is our judges are being more cognizant on the front end, right? In addressing the fines and fees at the time, right? So if an individual, they're making some inquiry as to whether or not the ability to pay at the current time. Right. So it's not just we're waiving fines and fees. Judges are also changing to address it at the front end, because the concern we had is if you don't address it at the front end, now we're back in this it's a cycle, and we're back in this situation again with all these individuals. So that's how now we had started doing that, but our court system has moved into a new computer system called Odyssey. So we had to pause until we can figure this new system out in hopes of restarting it later on. So that's how I came to this issue.
I love this approach of looking at cases both on the back end and the front end. Because we do see more and more every day coming through, and it takes so long to resolve those cases that if we don't kind of turn off that fire hose that's just drowning people, if we don't look at it at the front end, it becomes a much bigger issue. It's easier to solve it on the front end. Let's talk about those two groups, FTCs and FTAs. Our data shows those groups overlap. And when we dig into this issue at the Wilson Center, we see, there's various reasons someone may not come to court, and many of them relate to economics. So our interviews with people taught us that people miss court for a variety of reasons, including because they're not able to miss work without getting fired. Maybe they can't get childcare. Others feel like they already know what's going to happen there. So it's not, there's just no point in going. And one quote I heard is, you already know what's going to happen when you go to court. And I didn't have the money, so I didn't go to court. So I do think these issues are a little bit more intertwined than they may seem at face value. I'd love to turn to you, Senator Warren. Can you talk about I'm sorry, Senator Daniel, can you talk about how you see this issue as a resident of Western North Carolina, a small business leader, and about the attempts to resolve this in the legislature with your colleagues?
Sure. Thanks, Lindsay. So first, I think it's helpful to just remind people of the history of this issue is that, before 1985, there were no infractions. Everything was a misdemeanor. You could be arrested, or orders of arrest could be issued for any traffic offense. So the system we have now was designed to sort of stop that practice, so that infractions weren't criminal penalties. The things that DA Scott was talking about, they were just infractions. And then the small penalty was you have to show up to court, you have to deal with your case, and then you have to pay this small fine. So I think as a legislator, we have to, when you break the law, there has to be some ramifications. And then the question is, well, what's the proper penalty? Because, there are people that violate, that violate these infraction laws that could be a danger to other motorists on the highway. If you speed, if you're a 75 and a 55 person or whatever, you're out there speeding, you're driving around without insurance, and those types of things, those could be a danger to other motorists. So I think we just have to weigh it and figure out, now if we've got 1 million people without licenses. Actually, I was looking at a Duke study from 2020 that was from your law journal that says that of those, about 800,000 were failures to appear, about 250,000 were failures to comply, and 135,000 were for both. So I do think that there's more seriousness to, you have to show up in court. You should show up and just explain your circumstances. And I think the DA would probably agree with me that, you can't help somebody who won't show up. And then it just, that they become, the seriousness escalates. But, what can we do now for people who, and it would be great if we could have this data about who has not had a license for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years. They may be productive citizens. They just are either driving illegally, like Frankie said, or they're, riding a bike or a moped or something. Because, there's probably we need to figure out if there can be some sort of amnesty that could be offered to people after a period of years. Maybe you just sort of take this off of their driving record and you reduce it to a judgment. And so now maybe they have a judgment to the state, just like if you don't pay your court appointed attorney's fees, you get a judgment to the state. And then of course that expires after 10 years. So I think there's a lot of things that we could look at. There was actually a bill that Senator Britt, who is Matthew Scott's senator, filed in 2021, it was called License to Work, and it had some solutions that you could have sliding scale fines for people who had, less financial means. You could do maybe you let them pay payments over a period of a year, and no less than $10 a month or something. Because I think what gets some of these folks is that you have a pretty big fine and it has to be paid in a pretty short period of time. So if they had longer to pay, that could work. And of course, before 1985, they could put you on probation and pay, but we don't want to put people on probation for for improper equipment. So I think there's some things that could be done, but there's groups like the DA's conference that they would have to be convinced that this is the right solution. So we have to kind of touch the bases in the court system. What do the district court judges think? What do the DAs think? What do the law enforcement folks think? And once we can make everybody kind of on the same page, then there could be maybe a common sense solution to this.
Yeah, there's a lot of stakeholders interested in this issue, that's for sure. And I'm wondering, especially in a forum like this, where we have people from different areas, different expertise backgrounds, if we can get kind of creative. I mean, I'll start throwing an idea out here, and Jennifer, you can tell me if anything's coming in the chat, but we find that text reminders can help people remember to show up to court. If this is really just I forgot, or I can't figure out the courthouse parking, the courtroom I'm supposed to be in, what time I'm supposed to be there. When I was practicing in Wake County, that's a big courthouse. That's pretty hard to navigate, to be honest. So text reminders giving pretty detailed information about the logistics of getting to court, and reminding them, a calendar call is going to be at 9 a.m. If you're not there, maybe we can have a plan B for some folks. Maybe the window is expanded so that if you come in by 12, you're not called and failed. I'm also wondering if we could think back to COVID times. At that point, we didn't want people to come to court. We wanted fewer people in court, and we started using virtual hearings. And maybe that's an opportunity where folks can still show up to court, but it's on Zoom. Does that get any other ideas tipped off for folks, either in the audience or on our panel?
Well, Lindsay, I think that you mentioned something key when you said that we got a lot of stakeholders here. We was talking about the judges, the DAs, the law enforcement, but we didn't mention, again, people who are impacted. So if without that person at the table, so if the DA Association is having a meeting without impacted people being invited in, like the North Carolina Leadership Forum has showed us that can happen, you really limit yourself from a perspective that you're trying to solve from people when you don't have the people at the table who are, i.e. the victims. And I would like to do a shameless plug to say there are a few subject matter experts in the state of North Carolina on this issue, like Forward Justice, the Justice Center, Community Success Initiatives. So I think anytime this conversation is being had at any of the association levels, these groups ought to be in the room because they represent and advocate for people who are the victims of our discussion. And I say the victims lightly. But typically, when we're trying to solve that problem, I think those groups need to be in the room because I think we probably could be valued if we're looking at a few solutions. I jotted down a few. I think we need to fund training for judges, that they understand procedures and require courts to consider the defendant's ability to pay. I think we should also prohibit issuing arrest warrants solely for failure to pay criminal court fines and fees. And I think we need to also place some consideration on alternatives to fines and fees like community services or community or alternative community support programs. I think and I would say, from the legislature, I think they need to put together a bipartisan group to study this and make recommendation regarding the impacts of fees and fines on our residents. And that's just a few thoughts. It was like brought up a lot of emotions for me when I started looking back at it, other than the emotions that we find ourselves dealing with every day working with the people we support.
Yeah, what I see through all of the conversation today is that people want folks to have a second chance. I don't think anybody here is like, this should be the end of the road for someone and we're gonna write them off and we don't want them part of our community. It's just, how do we get there? How do we keep cases moving on the prosecutor's docket? How do we make sure people have the resources to get to court to pay what they need to pay? And that's a hard fix. I do think the community organizations that are working on this do have a great perspective, just like you said. And I do challenge us to think a little bit more creatively, since we all kind of we do want people to come to court and to show up, and we want our community to be safe, but we don't want to overly punish someone. So how do we strike that balance? Is there more of a carrot we can use instead of a stick, perhaps? Does anyone have some last thoughts they'd like to share? I know we're getting close to the end of our hour, and I'd love to hear more.
As at least for the time being, a decision maker when it comes to these charges, these with infractions and speeding tickets and stuff like that, I can tell you that personally, I do make a distinction in FTAs and FTCs. I can just say personally, I have not much leeway with FTAs, because I do believe that you have to come, if you're required to come to court, you need to come to court, because I can't handle the case. I can't give you the benefit of the doubt, right? If you don't show up to court and inform me of what's going on. I can't tell you how many times I've been in our traffic court and people shown up and said, Mr. Scott, here's the issue. I'm trying taking care of my mother. I'll give you one example in particular. I'm trying to get my mother to hospital appointments. My father's also sick. I'm trying to get a job. Once I get that information, I now can do something with that, right? If the person never comes into court, I just can't do anything with that. And if I did, the public would then demand stuff of me, right? So I think FTAs and FTCs, I do see a distinction in them. So now when you're talking about FTCs, what we've done is we've went back and the ones that we're waiving the fines and fees are our oldest ones, right? They're our oldest ones. And you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, it's like early 80s. This is like years. And if that person has not paid that fine and fee, they're not gonna pay it. And so if we need to clean up that docket and then deal with what we have in front of us, which are the most recent ones, and hopefully be more open in having these discussions. But because it's hard too, I can just talk about Robeson County. Our traffic court, before this odyssey, this new system, we would have sometimes 500, 600, 700 people on the traffic calendar. And you got an assistant DA in there trying to, their best to handle these cases on an individual basis, right? That's having to discuss and talk with these individuals. That lengthens the time. So but what I've done is stressed to our ADAs to try and get that information, at the time. Those that are represented by counsel who had a speeding ticket and got an attorney, we rely on that attorney to represent their client. And when I say represent their client, inform us, lack of a better word, decision maker, right, on all these issues so that we can make the best decision possible. So the more information, the better, so that we can make the best informed decision on each individual case. But I do make a distinction between FTAs and FTCs.
I'd just add to that. One, I want to acknowledge Frankie's point that, yeah, like if whatever solution, there should be people like the Justice Center who weigh in. And a lot of times we do get their opinions more often on things like landlord-tenant issues than criminal. But I was just thinking of one, I think one logistical problem with the system is that even if you get your court charges resolved, then now you got this DMV issue. And we all know that our DMV right now is basically dysfunctional. So I guess I just wonder if there's a way that we could structure it to where, you know, if you finally go to court and you get your previous issue resolved, could the judge issue an order that basically directs the DMV to restore your license without further, you know, hearing process or, you know, something like that? Because, you know, it's hard enough for you to come back and do this in one forum, but then have to turn around and do it in another forum is difficult for people.
I think that's a great idea. I've heard from practitioners say, you know, that last mile that people have to walk is so hard. And if we could automate that process, I think that would really benefit people. Sometimes I wonder if folks realize that their cases have been dismissed. DA Scott, how many? Oh, you have your hand raised. I'm sorry.
Now, I just wanted to, Senator Daniel brought up a point that is a thorn in my side when it comes to this issue. I mean, I've asked and looked into this DMV fee. One, from my understanding, cannot be waived by a court. So we're handling this stuff on our end, and these individuals that it's almost, for lack of a better word, giving a false sense of hope, right? Where we're waiving the fines and fees, but yet now they got to go to this DMV to address this restoration. And I don't know if you've been to a DMV lately, but if you haven't, don't go. I mean, I mean, it's just, and so we're giving people hope in one hand and turning them over to DMV on the other hand. And I get frustrated when I try and get a license. I imagine these people trying to get renewed license. I do have a valid license. Let's just make, but you know, we're giving them hope on one hand, and on the other, we're turning them over to DMV, and it's hard enough to get a license renewed, much less get it restored. And so I'd be honest with you, that DMV process, if it can get streamlined, I think would be helpful, because this whole process of waiving fines and fees, I've been uncomfortable with the fact that we're giving them hope on one hand, and we're turning them over to frustration on the other. And I don't like that, to be honest with you, but I also don't have control over it. But yeah, Senator Daniel brought up I'm glad he brought up the DMV point, because that is real. That is real. But yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Roberts, does that bring something back up for you that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I would agree. I mean, because yeah, the DMV part, but since again, I think that's why it's good to have maybe the legislature kind of study this, because we are talking about two state organizations. So, I mean, dealing with, you know, if the DMV can shake hands with the court system, and I think it's definitely doable. And I would say personally, this is one of the things that we didn't mention. So if we get a person, let's say to New Hanover County, out of prison, and he got a failure to comply or failure to appear in another county, we were able to, instead of having to take that person back to that county since it wasn't dealt with while he was in prison, we used to be able to just call the DA and say, hey, can you contact the DA in that county? Let them know the person is out of prison now, they're in the program, we're working seamlessly, and typically they was able to just forgive it and let it go, and we can move on with helping that person or providing an adequate second chance so it doesn't become a life sentence. And what our agency started doing is just paying DMV fees, and so the person can get their license back. Because at the end of the day, it benefits us all if the person got their license. And I know we need to hold people accountable, and that's why I think we need to look at alternatives to holding people accountable. And I would lastly say I got a grandson right now that's 22 that ended up with a ticket. They thought he was drinking, but when they took him downtown and he wasn't. And so he had to go to court, and he said, well, he called me after the fact to say, Granddad, I ain't go to court because I know I ain't had the money, and I know I was going to need $300, and I already knew they was going to make me go do this. And I said, boy, you supposed to handle and be accountable for your decisions. Whether since you wasn't drinking and driving, but you did fall asleep, you still got to accept the consequences. However, that means granddaddy gonna have to kick in. And if granddaddy don't kick in, I think there should have been alternatives for a person who just couldn't afford it, who at the end of the day was a good person. And I think that's why judges and DAs need to be able to assess adequately a person's ability to pay, and when a person is just don't intend on doing what's right. There are ways to measure all of that. And I think those are things we have to look at the end of the day. And I put a few things in the chat too, that like failure to pay or failure to appear, suspensions are not supposed to be punishment for the underlying traffic charge. There are other laws that punish for speed and failure to wear seatbelts, etc. And so I think, a lot of times I like what Matt said is I think we need to be clear on failure to appear, failure to comply, and what the consequences are. And I think a lot of times when you are clear with that, then it will encourage people to be more accountable.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I better wrap it up since we're at 1:05. But what a great conversation about how we can move forward. And I must say, at the Wilson Center, we of course believe the best conversations have a foundation in data. So here's my shameless plug for our dashboard created by a data scientist that Jennifer will put there in the chat. And it's in beta right now. We're still tweaking it a little bit, so feel free to give us feedback on it. But it is a nice way to drill down to your county, get some specifics about how your county is impacted. Thank you. Minda.
Yes, and I wanted to first apologize if we didn't get to your comment live. Jennifer's trying to post them, so appreciate all the engagement from the audience. And on behalf of the North Carolina Leadership Forum and the Wilson Center for Science and Justice, I just want to thank our panelists, Senator Warren Daniel, Mr. Frankie Roberts, and District Attorney Matthew Scott, for continuing to be candid and frank and direct and authentic in these conversations. That is the only way that we will be able to engage constructively and move forward and do something important together. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today to listen, and then also to our generous funders who are listed in the report, and they helped make the forum and the report possible. Lindsay, thank you for co-moderating. This was lovely, and just really appreciate everybody, and hope that you continue to do all the good work that you're doing, and know that those of us out here are rooting for you and supporting you and ready to engage with you and convene you again should we need to. So thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Minda.
Thanks. Thanks,
Thank
Minda.
you.
All right. Thanks
Bye-bye.
you,
Take
everybody.
good care. All right. Bye.